Assalamu alaikum fam, hope you're doing well. So, we're going into the 8th article. And if you're gonna write, I guess, theological texts and stuff, St. Thomas Aquinas, even though he's a Catholic, the guy is no idiot. He's a genius. He does know well how to confront atheists, secularists, philosophers, and such. And the style of his writing and the way he organizes his thoughts, the way he inserts his citations and such, you will benefit from that, especially if you want to write something similar. His volumes of his works are studied till this day, and anyone can see why. So, if you want to have a deep conversation with a high-level Catholic who has read this, and you have read all the hadiths, and you're very well versed, this conversation with someone like that would be mind-blowing. Especially if both of you understand each other. So, I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to understand the Catholic doctrine and the Islamic doctrine and other ones as well, because I do enjoy theology and philosophy. As a Muslim, I think it's important for us to actually know what we're talking about when we talk about other faiths. And since I was raised around Christianity and English is my first language, texts like this are very easy for someone like me. And so, well, by the will of Allah. But let's continue, alright? It's very exciting. We're in the 8th article, and it's titled, Whether Sacred Doctrine is a Matter of Argument. Okay, so we're going to go to objection 1. It seems this doctrine is not a matter of argument, for Ambrose says, De Fide 1, put arguments aside where faith is sought. But in this doctrine faith especially is sought, but these things are written that you may believe. John XX 31. Therefore, sacred doctrine is not a matter of argument. Now, this is interesting because it's almost like you don't even have something to argue about. So let's see. Reply objection 1. Although arguments from human reason cannot avail to prove what must be received on faith, nevertheless this doctrine argues from articles of faith to other truths. Okay, so notice this. Human reason cannot avail to prove what concerns the faith, right? So this is very interesting when you're dealing with very neckbeard, fedora wearing, philosophy 101 atheists who are very smug and want to be like Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens, and they all constantly mention logic or something like that, and they try to give you a paradox trap. That's more of a game of rhetoric with them than actually trying to prove what you can receive through faith. So it's very interesting how Aquinas goes about answering that. Now, we're in objection 2. Further, if it is a matter of argument, the argument is either from authority or from reason. So look at that. So an argument from authority or from reason. So if you're giving your opinion on something, are you reasoning for it? Or have you gotten it from an authority? That's a very good example. If it is from authority, it seems unbefitting its dignity, for the proof from authority is the weakest form of proof. But if from reason, this is unbefitting its end, because according to Gregory Homil.26, faith has no merit in those things of which human reason brings its own experience. Therefore, sacred doctrine is not a matter of argument. Now, this is a very interesting one. Faith has no merit in those things of which human reason brings its own experience. So faith versus what the experience of human reason. You're noticing how these are very condensed, potent objections that are being placed to Aquinas. Because even I would say, like, okay, we know that limited understanding of what humans can even do is going to be intense. Twofold wisdom, twofold knowledge, study versus obtained by revelation. These are very interesting concepts here. So let's go down to what he says. This doctrine is especially based upon arguments from authority. So arguments from authority, so basically Catholic scholars, inasmuch as its principles are obtained by revelation. So arguments upon authority, principles obtained by revelation. Do you follow? Thus, we ought to believe on the authority of those to whom the revelation has been made. So believing on the authority of those who receive the revelation. Nor does this take away from the dignity of this doctrine. So he's arguing that if you're looking to the authorities concerning those who have studied, or also maybe, as he argues, received revelation, maybe they're talking about Moses or something like that, that doesn't take away from the doctrine. Now, let's see if he's going to mention if there's hierarchy or something here, you know, a cardinal or the pope, or let's see if he brings that in, what he does, okay? For although the argument from authority based on human reason is the weakest. So look at that. The argument from authority based on human reason is the weakest. That's very interesting, because atheists will say it's the reverse. They will say, well, actually, a scientist is the strongest, therefore everything the scientist says, you need to believe it because it's the strongest form, because they've studied. You see the difference with how the theologians deal with the human mind versus the soul's destiny, right? Not just being pure materialists in the sense of human understanding. Yet the argument from authority based on divine revelation is the strongest. So arguments based from authority, and that authority is based on divine revelation. Okay? But sacred doctrine makes use even of human reason, not indeed to prove faith, for thereby the merit of faith would come to an end. So notice this. So the sacred doctrine of the Catholics, right? They'll make use for human reason to explain stuff, but it's not necessarily going to prove everything and the merits of the faith, right? But it can explain certain things to help others who maybe haven't had as much studious time to understand what's going on, right? But to make clear other things that are put forth in this doctrine, since therefore grace does not destroy nature. So notice this, grace does not destroy nature. I like how you said that, but perfects it. So raw nature, grace is more of a finesse. Grace perfects nature. Do you see what he's saying? Natural reason should minister to faith. Look at that. Natural reason should minister to faith, as the natural bent of the will ministers to charity. So I like how he worded that, right? Your reason is ministering to your own understanding of your religion. That's advice that I think any person can use in their religion. But you understand that there's limits, and as a Muslim I would say Allah knows best. But if you attempt to understand certain things, you can try, and then you ask a scholar who will use their reasoning, right? It's very interesting. Hence the apostle says, bring into captivity every understanding unto the obedience of Christ. 2 Corinthians x5. So that's interesting how he puts a citation there, biblical. Every understanding unto the obedience. Obedience, and that is understanding. Under, to understand, to be under, to, I would say you submit to Allah's will on the divine decree of Allah. But here they put it in a more Catholic sense, right? Hence, sacred doctrine makes use also of the authority of philosophers in those questions in which they were able to know the truth by natural reason. So, you see how philosophy comes into role here very uniquely? So, instead of saying all philosophers are evil, they're all deviants, they're all useless, never listen to them, never study anything they say, ignore them, put them to the side. Instead, the Catholics here, and Aquinas especially, saying, no, they have some modes of reasoning that can apply, but you'll just rein it in to where it doesn't go outside of the canon and the dogma, right? So here it's like, they'll utilize the authority of them to a degree, and I think that's very smart. As Paul quotes as saying, Aratus, as some also of your own poets said, for we are also his offering, Acts XVII 28. Nevertheless, sacred doctrine makes use of these authorities as intrinsic and probable arguments. So notice this. Sacred doctrine making use of intrinsic and probable arguments from the philosophical aim, you see? But properly uses the authority of the canonical scriptures. Okay, so they will also utilize human reason by the authority of the well-trained philosophers, but they will also reference, of course, the authority of their canonical scriptures, you see? Pretty much we expected that, right? As an incontrovertible proof, and the authority of the doctors of the church. So notice how they say doctors of the church, so that's another Catholic term. As one that for our faith rests upon the revelation made to the apostles and prophets, who wrote the canonical books. So, revelation given to the apostles and prophets, who then wrote it down in their canonical works, you see? And not on the revelations, if any such there are, made to other doctors. Hence, Augustine says, St. Augustine, I was reading his confessions on Vimeo on the Bookshelf Fellowship channel, but ever since Vimeo erased all my videos because I missed a payment, I'll continue that series on this channel later. But he's citing him, who's also a very important figure for theology students, because he did a lot of work. Only those books of scripture which are called canonical have I learned to hold in such honor as to believe their authors have not erred in any way in writing them. But other authors I so read as not to deem anything in their works to be true, merely on account of their having so thought and written, whatever may have been in their holiness and learning. So here you see that they have the church doctors who write canonical works, and he's saying that they are an authority that you can utilize. So it's very powerful, very potent, and I think it's very interesting how he's really just reiterating the fact that you can look at this as a matter of argument, but you have a certain limit to human understanding, and that the canonical works and divine revelation and sacred doctrine and all this has a mode to play in your understanding of your faith, right? Now, we're going to get over here to where he argues a little bit further. On the contrary, the scripture says that a bishop should embrace that faithful word, which is according to doctrine, that he may be able to exhort in sound doctrine and to convince the gainsayers. Aha! See that? So a bishop, he should be able to explain the doctrine soundly and exhort people to the point where he can win from the gainsayers. The gainsayers are the naysayers, which are the people who are always arguing. So you for the bishops, you don't just ignore and say, I'm gonna ignore it, I'm gonna ignore it, I'm gonna ignore it, or ignore. Don't answer. No, they're saying, train yourself by reading the canonical works and study the philosophers, so you can make pretty basic understandings of what they believe and what you believe, and also learning how to communicate effectively, and hopefully you will gain some level up of the gainsayers, right? So well training of the bishops here seems to be fundamental. I answer that, as other sciences do not argue in their proof of their principles, but argue from their principles to demonstrate other truths in these sciences. So this doctrine does not argue in proof of its principles, which are the articles of faith. So here again, articles of faith. But from them it goes on to prove something else, as the apostle from resurrection of Christ argues in proof of the general resurrection, 1 Corinthians XV. However, it is to be borne in mind in regard to the philosophical sciences, that the inferior sciences neither prove their principles nor dispute with those who deny them. So, again, mentioning the philosophical sciences here, he has dedicated much time to studying philosophy. Any philosophy student who thinks they shouldn't study theology is a complete buffoon and is being very lazy, because if a theologian like Aquinas can go about learning so much of philosophy and write 7 volumes, and you watch a couple Sam Harris videos and think you're some expert and just say logic and particles and watch some clips, and all of a sudden you're ready to be this atheist crusader, you're really an imbecile. So here he really just keeps reiterating the philosophical sciences, giving them credit where it's due, but also recognizing that the human mind is not to be worshipped to the absolute, that the inferior science neither prove their principles nor dispute with those who deny them, but leave this to a higher science. So the higher science would be the sacred doctrine, whereas the highest of them, viz. Metaphysics, can dispute with one who denies its principles, if only the opponent will make some concession. But if he concede nothing, it can have no dispute with him, though it can answer his objections. So answering objections, hence sacred scripture, since it has no science above itself, can dispute with one who denies its principles, only if the opponent admits some at least of the truths obtained through the divine revelation. So the opponent admitting that there can be truths that can come through divine revelation. So notice that. Divine revelation. Now, an atheist worships Daddy Darwin and trusts him and thinks the Big Bang Theory and all that, even though the scientists are utilizing their own reason and understanding to trace back billions of years to the beginning of time of the planet, right? They want you to believe their findings with their PhD and their narrow mind. But if you say, okay, well, you studied hard, I'll give you some leeway. Well, here he's trying to say, well, you can at least admit that there are valid principles and truths that can come from divine revelation. So you need to have a sort of middle ground here when you're talking to them. Thus, we can argue with heretics from the text and Holy Writ. So arguing with heretics with the Holy Writ. And against those who deny one article of faith, we can argue from another. If our opponent believes nothing of divine revelation, there is no longer any means of proving the articles of faith by reasoning, but only of answering his objections. Okay, so right there, if he's still like, okay, I don't believe in anything, nothing of divine revelation, nothing can ever true be said in divine revelation, well then, you're going to have to answer his objections, and then arguing for articles of faith by reasoning should be put on the back burner, and now you need to answer his objections, you see? So it's interesting, very different modes of proving articles of faith by reasoning versus also just answering his objections as best as you can. If he has any against faith, since faith rests upon infallible truth, and since the contrary of a truth can never be demonstrated, it is clear that the arguments brought against faith cannot be demonstrations, but are difficulties that can be answered. So, you see that? Arguments that are brought against your religion, sometimes you can't demonstrate it, but you can try to answer the difficulties that are confusing people, and you can do that by proving articles of faith by reasoning, or just answering standard objections. So here in the 8th article, he's really laid out matters of argument and how you go about doing it, and that you truly can try, but that it is a different type of science, right? And very potent, I have to say. And notice how he is really good at his in-text citations, both of other Catholic scholars, but also of the Bible itself. So if you're going to write in some fashion, you should try to write like him. And if you're going for English students or something like that, because his way of writing is very structured, organized, and approachable, and indeed potent. So I thought this would be a very good one to share with you. It's very interesting.